Research shows that you're much safer if you don't own a firearm, but the reason why might surprise you. Often the conversation around gun laws centers around trying to prevent homicides. This often comes up whenever there's a mass shooting or some other gun-related tragedy. But actually, stricter gun laws would have the greatest impact on reducing suicides. Suicides outnumber homicides by more than 2 to 1. Many people believe that thinking about suicide only happens for those who are severely mentally ill, but actually it's quite common. A big national study found that about 7% of people had serious suicidal thoughts just in the previous year. Thankfully, a very small minority of them actually act on those thoughts, but even those who do act on suicidal intentions usually immediately regret it and don't attempt to suicide for the rest of their life. In fact, if you survive your first suicide attempt, you're 93% likely to never commit suicide in your entire lifetime. In other words, for most people, a suicide attempt is due to a moment of despair and hopelessness, a moment of weakness that many of us suffer through at some point in our lives. It doesn't take severe mental illness to want to kill oneself, but oftentimes those intentions are fleeting. What really increases the chance that someone will successfully commit suicide is whether or not they have access to a firearm at that moment. If someone tries to commit suicide through cutting, poisoning, or overdosing on drugs or alcohol, they're actually only about 5% likely to end up killing themselves. But if a person tries to use a firearm to kill themselves, they're over 90% successful. With those odds, it makes sense why access to a firearm is the #1 predictor of committing successful suicide. In fact, researchers at Harvard and elsewhere have found that simply having access to a gun increases your risk of suicide by 3 times, even after controlling for gender, social economic status, type of neighborhood, drug and alcohol use, employment status, and depression and anxiety disorders. Because regardless of your race, gender, or standing in life, we're all bound to have certain moments of despair and hopelessness. So the real predictor of whether or not someone actually kills themselves is if it's easy to do in that moment, namely if they have access to a gun. But this begs the question, if we take guns out of households, will that actually prevent suicides, or will people who are determined to kill themselves just find other means? Well, actually, there's been some really interesting test cases in this around the world. One of the most large-scale examples was in Australia in the late 90s. There was a massacre of 35 individuals at Port Arthur, Australia, and so the country adopted much stricter gun laws, which effectively removed 50% of the household guns in the whole nation over a 10-year period. And as gun rates started to fall, so did suicide rates. In fact, suicide by firearms dropped by 80%. And actually, suicides by other means didn't go up. So passing stricter gun laws definitely saved lives by making sure that people couldn't commit suicide in that moment of weakness. Similar gun laws have recently been passed in Switzerland and Israel, and they've already seen these same results. Not owning a gun is one of the best things you can do to prevent yourself from being the victim of gun violence, either by your own hand or by someone else's. Because as we talked about, having access to a gun triples the risk of suicide, but it also doubles the risk that you'll be shot, most often by a friend or spouse during a heated argument. Again, we all have bad moments in our life, whether it's moments of despair or anger. And the last thing a person needs in that moment is access to a firearm. So no matter what your life circumstances or what kind of neighborhood you live in, you're simply safer not having a gun in the home.